Brothers and sisters in Christ, on the 16th of October, just gone, we remembered the 46th anniversary of the election of Pope St. John Paul II. He was the 265th Pope and successor of St. Peter. Tonight, in this vigil, we commemorate the 19th anniversary of his death. Like the other saints of God, he was determined to be a saint, simply by following the call of God in obedience and to serve his fellow men in his vocation as a priest. We know that when man cooperates with the grace of God, the marvels of history are worked. The marvels of history were worked in the life of Pope St. John Paul II, and history will record that fact, and does record it. In his ministry, like Christ himself, he would be despised and rejected, not only by militant atheists, but by many Catholics who are supposed to be close to him as collaborators, but who sadly had other worldly ambitions. Pope John Paul, as you know well, was the first non-Italian pope in 455 years. And some suggest he was the greatest non-martyred pope of all time. But as I said, he will go down in history as a martyr for the faith, to which we are all called in the world of today. I am convinced that Almighty God gives us a certain Pope for our age, assuming the Pope is the wish of the Holy Spirit. In the case of Pope St. John Paul II, there was no need of any lobby to elect him. He was not elected on the first ballot in the conclave of October 1978. Just a short time after the death, the 33-day pontificate of Pope John Paul I, who died from a heart attack. That first ballot of the cardinals elected Cardinal Siri of Genova, who died at the age of 82 in 1989, but who would have been Pope age 72 had he accepted the papacy at the time of the conclave. He was certainly a papabile, and when chosen, he surprisingly said, "Non placet." It does not please me. That's the option for somebody who's elected from the College of Cardinals. They asked him, "Will you be pleased to accept?" And he said, "No, non placet. It doesn't please me." Thereby opening the door for Cardinal Karol Wojtyła, the Cardinal Archbishop of Krakow in Poland. The cardinals were, as you can imagine, well aware that the great threat to the Catholic Church then, to the world, and to Christianity itself was the threat of Soviet militant atheism. This atheism sought to annihilate Christianity from the face of the earth. No human mind was capable of thinking this way. It was a demonic idea, and one of its goals was to kill the Polish Pope himself, because he was a threat to communism in Poland, and especially behind those in the Iron Curtain. Pope John Paul II was a gift to the Church and to the world. He came at the right time, a time when the threat of nuclear war was very close, a time when the Soviets had plans to invade all of Europe. Pope John Paul was a special gift from Our Lady herself, and in fact his pontificate had been foreseen in different times by different people in different countries. There was, let us say, in a mystical sense, a prophetic dimension attached to his life and works, that even the demons became afraid of this future pope. and the powerful consecrations he would make in order to save the world from mutual nuclear destruction between the East and the West. An example of this prophetic dimension I speak about occurred in 1848, when a Polish poet by the name of Juliusz Słowacki wrote a poem which is called in English, "Among the Discord, God Rings a Bell." In this poem, he prophesied that a Polish man would soon become the first Slavic pope in history. He said that he was inspired to write such a thing and never regretted doing so. In 1979, there was a cryptic apparition in Knock, which I would say has been misunderstood. Misunderstood in this sense that the prophetic dimension of it was excluded completely. I would say that to you based on my research, that this silent apparition foretold in a way the arrival of a great bishop to Ireland who would preach the gospel. All seers stated that he wore a bishop's hat, something that John the Evangelist never wore. Pope St. John Paul came to Ireland exactly 100 years later. And he stated in Knock that the goal of his journey, in other words, he said, the reason I came to Ireland was to come to Knock. The consecration he made then of all the Irish people is so profound that it will prove that this is the correct interpretation. Not only that, but the large cross in Knock, as you well know, states that the coming of Pope John Paul to Ireland was the greatest event in Irish history since the arrival of St. Patrick. He was certainly foreseen in Knock, but this has not yet been recognized. I have published it in volume 3 of the Compendium of Authentic Marian Shrines, which today is in the Vatican Libraries, and it's in our own academy, the Pontifical Marian Academy. In 1882, there was another vision, when a pope was mystically foreseen on the bow of a ship by St. John Bosco. As he stood waving to the people, he was shot and killed, but strangely he stood up immediately again and continued his work. Some years ago, I was asked by the Salesians to interpret the dream of the 2 columns in the sea. You may remember it. I do have an image of it. I'll show it to you later. On the top of the smaller column stood the Virgin Mary with her title written below it as Auxilium Christianorum, Our Lady, Help of Christians. On the top of the larger column was the Holy Eucharist. Tied to these 2 columns by 2 anchors and chains was a huge sailing ship with the Pope on the bow. The sailing ship was surrounded by smaller boats that were attacking this large sailing ship. The boats were armed with guns and books. The guns and books represented the military might of the Soviet Union and its satellite states. The books were symbolic of the promotion of communist propaganda. Militant atheism, which is spread mostly today through universities, is contrary to the first commandment, as St. Matthew's Gospel records the very words of Jesus when he states that we are duty-bound to love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our soul, and with all our mind. This means the effective love of God, the cor et cor loquitur, the spiritual love of God through prayer and popular devotions, and the intellectual love of God, to become fascinated by knowing God through study, by knowing God through prayer, by knowing God through infused knowledge, all of which are ignored by the spreading atheism of today. If we do keep the first commandment, it is the foundational commandment of all of them. If we keep the first, we'll keep the rest. If we don't keep the first one, there's no point in keeping the rest. I studied the two columns in the sea and saw that the devotions to the Holy Eucharist and to the Holy Virgin Mary are the two fundamentals of the Catholic faith. But this was not a full interpretation, as I had left out the Pope, who was standing on the ship, directing its way to safety against a ruthless assault by its enemies. In the writings of the fathers of the Church, the Cappadocian fathers in particular, Theodore of Mopsuestia, I found an answer to one of these questions, that there was a special devotion in the 2nd century to what was known as the three white doves. That is, to the Holy Eucharist, to the Holy Virgin Mary, and to the Holy Father. But this was not the answer I was looking for either. To explain the two columns in the sea, I had to dig deeper into the mystery as to what they might mean. Jewish history speaks of the pillars of the earth and how it is that the earth is supported by 7 pillars. We speak cosmologically here when we say these 7 pillars are the Sun, Venus, Mercury, the Moon, Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars. I began to look at the 2 pillars again and rename them, or the 2 columns, and I renamed them 2 pillars. But pillars of what? Pillars of faith, pillars of devotion, pillars of love. No. What I was looking at here were 2 pillars of time. I was looking at a sort of time capsule, and I began to see that the pillar of Our Lady represented the Marian year of 1987-1988. And the pillar of the Holy Eucharist represented the year of the Eucharist, so proclaimed by Pope St. John Paul II, which went from October 2004 to October 2005. Pope John Paul didn't live to see the end of that year. But between 1987 and 2005, we saw the total collapse of the Soviet military empire, which had as its core the obliteration of Christianity from the face of the earth. But this ambition was blocked by one man, by the powerful consecration of the world that he made in 1984 in response to the request of Our Lady of Fatima. The image of the 2 pillars in the sea was painted by Saint Maximilian Kolbe for publication in his magazine, The Knights of the Immacolata. I photographed Pope St. John Paul II standing on the bow of a huge sailing ship in Gdansk in 1987, which was the Marian year. What I was actually looking at was the vision of St. John Bosco come to life, the prophetic dimension of which was being fulfilled before my very eyes. And I will show you those pictures that I brought with me. In the July apparition of 1917 at the Cova da Iria in Fatima, Saints Jacinta and Francisco Marco, along with their older cousin and soon to be beatified, Lucia de Jesus Rosa dos Santos, were given a secret which had 3 parts. The first was a frightful vision of hell, during which they saw demons and people being tossed around by a burning wind as they howled and shrieked with blasphemies against God. The second part of the secret referred to the consecration of Russia and the 5 first Saturday devotions to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. This conjunction "and" is one of the most important conjunctions in the world. It also referred to the Second World War, which would come about because of man's terrible sins. Atheism, abortion, which kills not only the child and eventually its mother, but the generational offspring of the unborn child. Abortion does not just kill one child, It kills whole generations of people who are in the mind of God, but who will now never get a chance to be born. Here in this message of Fatima, we have for the first time in human history an analysis of where humanity stands before God in the words, the very words of Our Lady herself, when she said that God is already too much offended. In the third part, the three children saw an angel with a flaming sword pointing at the earth, who cried aloud, "Penance, penance, penance." It was as though the angel wanted to set the world on fire. After this, they saw a bishop dressed in white, which they knew was the Pope. He was walking through a city half in ruins. They were looking at the Roman Forum, Rome, with a halting step. As you know, he had slipped on the bathroom floor and broken his femur bone so close to his hip that it could not be repaired. So he walked with a full step and a half step, or if you wish, a halting step. The children saw that he was afflicted with pain and sorrow as he climbed up a mountain where he prayed for the souls of the corpses, the martyrs he met along the way. Having reached the top of the mountain, he was killed by a group of soldiers who fired bullets and arrows at him. In my book, Fatima, O Fatima, I identify this group of soldiers spoken of in this prophetic vision of 1917, which occurred 3 years, by the way, before Pope John Paul was even born. And it was 46 years, or 64 years, before the assassination attempt. He had been foreseen again. The soldiers who were foreseen were not just Mehmet Ali Agca from the Turkish Grey Wolves, who was to be the main assassin, the one who fired the gun. There was also in St. Peter's Square on the 13th of May 1981, Oral Selik from the Turkish Grey Wolves, another assassin, who was to shoot the Pope in the back. Bekir Selenk, another Turkish Grey Wolf, who was ordered to explode a suicide bomb. And Zilo Vaselev, the Bulgarian KGB agent, all of whom were to be paid $10,000 in advance by Yuri Andropov, the then head of the KGB, who went on to become the head of the Soviet Union and who was the most evil of all in the Soviet Politburo. Yes, the Pope was shot, as the prophetic dimension tells us. He recovered, he asked to see the secret of Fatima, and he recognized that it referred to himself. He went to Fatima for the first time in 1982 to thank Our Lady for saving his life. He met Sister Lucia for the first time then. In 1983, Pope John Paul went to meet Mehmet Ali Agca in his prison cell, where they spoke for 20 minutes. Agca told him on that occasion that the gun was aimed at his heart, but somehow an invisible hand had pushed his arm down with extraordinary strength. There's no doubt it was the hand of Our Lady. There were 5 other attempts on the life of Pope John Paul, including one by a priest, Father Crone, who stabbed the Pope with a bayonet in Fatima in 1982. I've shown a little bit of how important Pope John Paul was and is to the world, so much so that even heaven was announcing his coming here among us. And he is here with us tonight as a saint in his relics, and you will all receive a special blessing later on. During his third longest pontificate in the history of the Church, he traveled to 129 countries on all 5 continents. He declared more saints and blesseds than all the other popes put together. He wrote 14 encyclical letters, 15 apostolic exhortations, and over 600 apostolic constitutions, 45 apostolic letters, and the list goes on and on. There are two great soundbites that he left to the world. Duc in altum, launch out into the deep. And do not be afraid, because fear inhibits, makes us defensive, rather than being open to God and to love. There are so many personal stories that I could tell you, perhaps on another occasion. But after his death, reports came immediately of great miracles, which were flooding the congregation for the causes of the saints. At one count, there were over 35,000 miracles. Two of these miracles were used for his beatification and his canonization. The first was the Sister Simone Pierre Normand of the Little Sisters of Catholic Motherhood, who was healed 2 months after Pope John Paul's death in 2005. She had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. She was close to death and had an inspiration to ask for a pen and paper on which she scribbled, "Pray to Pope John Paul for me." Mother Superior asked the sisters to begin a novena immediately. On the third day, Sister Simone Pierre, who was normally in the infirmary, woke up as the nurse was gone to the bathroom, got dressed and worked her way down to the chapel. And as she genuflected before the Blessed Sacrament, she realized she'd been healed. That was accepted for his beatification. A second miracle was accepted for the canonization was the healing of a Costa Rican woman, Floribeth Mora Diaz, who collapsed in 2011 while preparing dinner at home with her husband and 5 children. She was diagnosed with a serious brain aneurysm, so big it was inoperable. She was dying. She turned to Pope John Paul for help. She said 2 words to an image of him, of his, by her bedside. She said, "Help me." The image came alive and spoke to her and said, "Get up and go home." The aneurysm had disappeared. These may seem remote, but there are some miracles through this particular relic that I have come across. In 2015, I'd been asked to speak in Gallia, and there was a woman next to me who gave me a piece of the seat she was sitting on, and I thanked her. I didn't know who the woman was, only she came from Coleraine. And I didn't know she suffered from alopecia extremis. In other words, she was bald. I said to her, because she wore a scarf, "Whatever you want from Pope John Paul, ask him tonight and tell him I said he was to do it." I had the privilege of working with him for many years as a theologian. And so she went up to be blessed, and as it happened, she got the relic containing the hair of Pope John Paul. This relic contains his blood. And she wept. And on her way home, and I knew nothing about this for many months later, the boy in the car said, "Mummy, turn down the heat. I'm sweating." And she said, "The heat isn't on." He said, "Where's the heat coming from?" She said, "It's coming from my head." She went home. Several other things happened, but this is a short version. And in the morning, there were many screams that came from the bathroom. So much so the neighbors called the police. The police came and they found the family in the hallway knocking on the bathroom door. "Open up, open up." Eventually the police got her to open the door, and she stood in front of them with a full head of blonde hair. I was invited to her testimony in Gallia, and she didn't know who I was, and I didn't know who she was, but she was up at the Ambo, and she was talking about this miracle and running her fingers through her hair. Of course, I was green with envy watching this. And she talked about this wee man that sat next to her. She didn't know my name from Adam. So miracles do happen. The saints are not gone off on holidays. They still work and pray for the church. The second miracle, and they're not always medical miracles. A second miracle I told some years ago in Park. Some of you may remember it, but it's still a profound miracle. At my home in Galway, got a phone call from somebody in Cork. I could hardly understand the accent. I never heard of the village they came from, so I said, speak slowly, slowly. And it was an invitation. It was a nun inviting me to come down with the relic. I said, it'll have to come from the priest. The invitation, I thank you, but the invitation. So eventually, 2 weeks later, this priest phoned me, and for the first 10 minutes, I hadn't the faintest idea what he was talking about. So I said, Father, could you repeat all of that again slowly? I wasn't attuned to the Cork accent. So basically, he invited me down, and we agreed on a Wednesday morning. I said, how many will be at Mass? He said, about 50. I said, wonderful. So I arrived with the blue box, with the relic inside, and I went to the main door of the church, and there were some people blocking the door. It's one of my pet hates, by the way, people standing in a doorway. And I tried to negotiate my way into the church. And one man said to me, where are you going by? I said, I'm trying to get into the church. So he said, well, why do you think we're out here? I said, I haven't the faintest idea. Are you Catholic, atheist? What are you? He said, the church is packed. We can't get in, so you can't get in. I said, what's going on? Is it a funeral? Is it a wedding? Well, he said, you must be the only man in Cork who doesn't know what's going on here this morning. So I looked at him and said, what is going on? He said, the relics of Pope John Paul are arriving here this morning from the Vatican in a helicopter. So I said, is there a sacristy door I could get into? Eventually I got into the sacristy door, and it was a rare occasion. I found a priest kneeling down before a crucifix. And I, like that, and he turned around and he said, you better be William Thomas. And I said, I am. He said, thank God for that. He said, I was afraid to go out. We've never seen the church so full. There's no room, they're sitting down the main aisle. And I went out, there's total silence. And I placed the relic on the altar. And after the gospel, he invited me to say a few words, which I did. And then, after Mass, he asked me to impart the blessing on the people. That was 10 o'clock Mass. At 2:45, I finished. I didn't have a glass of water, nothing. I still didn't have my breakfast, believe it or not. And when I went out the door, there was a man leaning on a jeep. And he said, hello. I said, hello. He said, my name is Michael. I'm your driver. I said, you're my driver? He said, yes. Father wants you to visit the hospital. I said, you have a hospital here? And apparently everything was arranged. They drove me to the hospital. Matron and 2 nuns, or 2 nurses, came out with candles, and one had a bell, and they brought me. I blessed 180 people in that hospital. And then I was looking forward to something to eat. They said, oh no, we've got 2 nursing homes in town. They're waiting for you. I began to realize this wasn't my schedule. This was Pope John Paul's schedule. So I went along with it. And I spoke at the nursing homes, give people a lot of hope. But the Pope recognized their sufferings, and he was with them, and he was blessing them. And eventually I said, what else is on the menu that you haven't told me about? Well, he said, there's 2 busloads coming out of Cork tonight, and we have the Mercy Convent and the Poor Clares to go to, and we have another rendezvous at my house at 11 o'clock, but there's a few individuals you have to see in the meantime. I said, okay, fine. So we went to this house, and I met the family at the door, and I brought the box with me, with the relic, and they said, upstairs, last door on the left. So I went up, very small townhouse. And the strangest thing happened to me as I stood at the door and looked in. There was an old lady sitting by the window. She had her overcoat on her. And I said to her, the Pope has come to bless you. And she said, which Pope? And I said, Pope John Paul II. Well, in that case, she said, you better come in. And I was no sooner in the door when she said to me, from the day that man was elected on the 16th of October 1978 until the day he died on the 2nd of April 2005, I prayed intensely for his pontificate every day. And since he died, he's the only one I pray to. So I blessed her with the relic. And she asked to embrace it, which she did. And then she said the most extraordinary, magical words that came to my ears that day. She said, would you like a cup of tea? I said, yes, I would. And she stood up and she went down to the kitchen. Everybody was crying at the stage. I knew something had happened. I didn't know what it was. She made some tea. I was talking with her. Very nice lady. And this fella, Michael, was dragging me away. So I said to the woman, I have to go, but I want you to know Pope John Paul has heard your prayer. He loves you. He's come to visit you, and he's blessed you. And on the way up to the Jeep, her son came running after me. And he said, thank you very much. I said, you're welcome. He said, great miracle, he said. That's the first time in 15 years that my mother has left that bedroom. And I said, what happened? He said, my older brother was a paramedic, ambulance driver. And he was driving a drug-crazed woman from this town into Cork Hospital. And she got out of the gurney in the ambulance and came forward, and with an electrical cord, she strangled this woman's son and killed him as he drove the ambulance. The ambulance crashed. He was thrown out the window. The ambulance went over him, but he was already dead. The woman didn't have a scratch on her. It seemed like a terrible injustice. At the funeral, the woman cried aloud in the church, and she asked God, why did you take my son? She said, all deals are off now. Our relationship is over. She didn't go to the burial. She went home and she stayed in that bedroom for 15 years. On the first Friday of each month, the priest came to her with Holy Communion, but she refused to take it. He would ask her, will you reconcile? She said no. 2 years before I went there, the priest arrived, by the way, that night at 11:30 when I was giving another talk. And he said, a great miracle has happened in this particular house. I said, yes, The woman left the bedroom. He said, no, bigger than that. He said, I went to see her every first Friday. And I asked her to reconcile, and she always refused. She was so angry with God. So I asked her 2 years ago. I said, what would it take for you to reconcile with God before you die? And without any hesitation, she said, I'll tell you what, Father. When Pope John Paul walks through my bedroom door, I will reconcile. The priest came to tell me that she had reconciled that very night. And she was at Mass next morning. The Pope had heard her prayers. The Pope hears your prayers. And he is here tonight. He's not gone away. He's still working in the church, for the church, by his prayers and good works. And we pray for healing, for miracles. St. Teresa of Avila would always say, never ask God for something small, because his majesty is so powerful, so wonderful. He has created the whole world. You'll insult him. Always ask for something big, bigger than you can imagine. Ask him. He hears your prayers, and he will answer. So there's a little reflection on the life, the prophetic dimension of Pope St. John Paul II, and the power of being a saint of God, to which we were all called. And the one thing I note, I just published a new book, my 44th book, believe it or not, and it's on the incorrupt saints. Each one of them had a determination to become a saint. We are called to be saints. We are called to the heights of holiness. Do we have that determination to become a saint of God? That's the question I leave with you tonight. I remember last year I gave a youth conference in Dublin, and the bishops and the religious were there, and a lot of young people. And I said to them, how many of you would like to go to heaven? Show of hands. And they all put their hands up. And I said, I'm edified beyond belief that you all want to go to heaven. I said, how many would like to go to heaven today? Not one hand was raised. And I said, well, that's precisely it. You're not prepared. You're not ready. The wise virgins were ready and waiting. That's our disposition. We must be always ready, determined to be a saint of God, because he has invited us to know and love him and to live with him forever in heaven as an adopted son and daughter. We must think about these wonderful things. Seek the things that are above. God bless you. I invite you to come up. I'll give you a blessing with the relic of Pope John Paul. I'll pray for you. It's him that's giving the blessing, not me. Thank you. And I leave the